Let me go right in. So first of all, I would like to thank everyone, all the presenters and the moderators and the audience. It's been such a wonderful occasion for all of us to think about this very complex concept. And what we try to do in Judaism, Science, and Medicine group conferences is to focus on interdisciplinarity. And you saw what happens when we bring together philosophers and religious studies scholars and psychologists and sociologists, life science people, all together to work toward an understanding of a complex concept and with a very rich history. So I'm an intellectual historian, and I will speak from that perspective. So methodologically speaking, I'm closest probably to the lecture by Professor Eisen yesterday. Now, let me contextualize a little bit to those who are not familiar with my work. So I actually spent writing this book on happiness in premodern Judaism was a labor of love that lasted about 10 years. I started it in 1993 roughly, and it came out in 2003. Then I kind of moved away from that conversation, about which I'll tell you more. And I spent basically the next 2 decades writing these books. So this is an edited volume about Judaism and ecology. This is more theoretically a focus on what exactly goes into the concept of thinking about nature from a Jewish perspective, especially philosophically so. And this book is still not out yet. It will be out in June. But when I speak about Jewish environmentalism. So you can ask, how can you connect those two? And the answer is quite clear that without the natural conditions that we need to thrive on Earth, we won't be able to be here. So protecting the Earth and caring for the well-being of the Earth is very much part of what we need to take into consideration when we think about the future. I think that Professor Hebron actually raised some of those environmental issues in the lecture yesterday, but clearly we need to think about how humanity will flourish. So for me, there's a big connection between the concepts of happiness that I did in this older book and those 3 books. Here you see on the right side of this, you see a reference to St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology. And I put it there because 4 essays of mine about happiness are going to appear in that encyclopedia. So both Joel Geraboff and I are people who are part of this grant that Adam Cohen and Kathy Johnson were engaged in. And my contribution was basically the intellectual history of the concept of happiness. And that's what I will share with you. And hopefully I can do it in less than 40 minutes. So here are my main arguments. Basically, I'm saying that it's not the case that Judaism didn't talk about happiness. On the contrary, I argue that throughout Jewish intellectual history, this has been a consistent and persistent theme. There's just no way to understand Jewish history and Jewish culture, Jewish thought without reflecting on that concept. Now, of course, why is that the case? Because if you think about happiness, that's the context within which you explore really the meaning of being Jewish, the meaning of being human, the relationship between the sexes, the attitude toward life and death, relationship between body and mind, and so forth and so on. So it's basically my argument in the book that I published in 2003 was that it's kind of a framework, an overarching framework of thinking about the meaning of Judaism. Of course, Jews never agree with each other, what it means to be Jewish, how to be Jewish, what's important, what are the values. And that kind of internal debate also extends to the debate between Judaism and representatives of other religious traditions. So there's always a need to explore to oneself what Judaism means and to explore it also to others. I also link the concept of happiness to process of secularizations, and there's a big difference between how Jews in the pre-modern world or the modern world or now the contemporary world, how they think about happiness, how they engage it, whether they call it happiness or flourishing or well-being. So you'll see all of those three terms will appear here. So the bottom line is, as an intellectual historian, I think that that's the best way of dealing with the complexity of the issue. I'm not saying that you don't need philosophy. Of course you do. I don't say you don't need psychology. Of course you do. And you'll see that the intellectual historian can put together all of those contributions. Now, when I started to write, to think about happiness, this was the only book at the time kind of that really had, this is by Dennis Prager. Many people, I'm sure, know where he is politically and where he is theologically. But the book is actually interesting because he said happiness is a serious problem. And he argues, he was one of the first people to say that in Judaism, the discourse on happiness begins with Aristotle. Not that it begins with Aristotle, but you need to know Aristotle in order to think through what happiness means. Now, during this conversation of the next 30 or 40 minutes, you'll see that that's where we are today. Today, it's not just that happiness is a serious problem. That happiness is really a serious business. A lot of economists are involved in it. There's a lot of conversation how to commodify happiness. And that's, I think, part of the problem. How did we change from this to this? A lot has happened. And that what has happened is one of the things that I will try to show when I try to connect the secularization of the discourse on happiness to other things. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm basically closer, I guess, to this than to these two books. So we already heard the name of Aristotle mentioned. I actually originally didn't have this slide on, but because I expected Professor Hebron to tell us a lot more about Aristotle, and also I asked him yesterday about it. But it seems to me that we really need to take into consideration the complexity and even perhaps a self-contradiction in the teachings of Aristotle on happiness and flourishing. So I think it's this legacy. It's a legacy of Aristotle. It kind of forces us, not forced us in any kind of a legal way, but kind of compelled us to think about it or to frame the questions in a certain way. So for him, happiness or flourishing is the highest good. But the point is, and that point kind of got lost in our conversations yesterday, happiness is the activity of the soul that manifests perfect goodness. So the connection between we cannot think about happiness and not talk about the soul. It's not just what we do, but it's the quality of our inner life. So happiness for him, for Aristotle, is the only good that is pursued for its own sake. Everything else, every other good, whether it's friendship, for example, is pursued for the sake of something else. But happiness is the only thing that is self-sufficient and complete. And it's an objective thing. If happiness can be recognizable, is manifested, you can see that somebody is actually flourishing, as opposed to saying languishing, about which we heard quite a lot yesterday. And the key to happiness is the cultivation of character traits, the virtues. And the whole point of the Nicomachean Ethics is to show us how that can be done. So I'm not going to go into it, but the point is that virtue, activities of the soul, character traits, practice, these are all conceptually related to each other. So it gets complicated because Aristotle actually said rather two different things in his famous book, The Nicomachean Ethics. For most of the book, he's actually telling us that to be happy, we need to be active in the social and political life. And it's a lot easier. For most of us, we won't have too much trouble accepting that. But yet in the last book of the Ethics, that's the chapter, the book 10, which I showed in the previous slide, the focus is actually on the contemplative activities. So it's only those who contemplate, only those who think through, only those who really grasp necessary truth, only these people really reach the highest good. So you can see that there is a real tension within the writings of Aristotle. And didn't illustrate it to you or didn't demonstrate it to you, but trust me, there's a lot of literature on these built-in contradictions and attempt by later readers to solve this. So did Aristotle contradict himself? Maybe. Or perhaps, as Jonathan Lear, also a person who was mentioned in previous session by Pninit, when he suggests that is happiness a teleological principle by which we value it. I can see the full citation here, but happiness itself lies beyond the teleological principle. So what exactly does it mean for Aristotle to be happy? It's all about interpretation. That's, I guess, the bottom line point that is relevant for what I need to show. So here are 4 books that show the reception of Aristotle in Western culture. We don't have time to go into it, but in my book, in this book, I talk about this chapter. If you read this book too, which I highly recommend, and I'll tell you more about it in a minute, but this is a book by a Christian theologian. Actually, she was originally Jewish. She converted, and she gives the entire narrative about happiness from the Bible, basically to contemporary Christian thought. Obviously, she covers both the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is more book on philosophy, where Cisla Bach is giving us the history of the concept of happiness in Western philosophy. And this is a book on Islam. And the point here, I think we had a question about it. Where is Islam in the story? Well, they're very much also doing what we are doing here, looking at contemporary concepts such as positive psychology and try to figure out how Islam responds to it. So all of these kind of books speak about the reception and the absorption of Aristotle and the integration of Aristotle with the monotheistic tradition. Now, how do you interpret Aristotle? If I'll just give you a quick kind of taste. If you're not familiar with Maimonides, of course, most Jews know who Maimonides was, but probably didn't get into the subtleties of what Maimonides says about happiness. But basically, what we see with Maimonides is a full integration of the Aristotelian position on happiness, with modification. I'm not saying that there are not, of course there is, but the point for Maimonides is that happiness, the highest good, the summum bonum, is intellectual perfection. So we have to really take it seriously that these people in the Middle Ages did speak very carefully or very thoughtfully and they really took it seriously, that it's the intellectual perfection that can lead you to immortality. After the death of the body will die, but what can remain after the death of the body is the intellect, but only if you perfected your intellect, only if you actualize your intellectual capacity. If you didn't do much with it, then you're no more than just a body. Now, Maimonides is a very complex thinker, very ambiguous thinker. I won't get into all of those issues, but interpreting Maimonides itself, look at this, the fact that two books published about two decades apart actually use even the same title. So clearly we cannot really understand, or we cannot take Maimonides at his word. We really need to be quite subtle in how we interpret what he wrote in The God of the Perplexed versus what he wrote in his legal works, and work out the details. So I have a whole chapter in the book on happiness just trying to sort out the complexity of Maimonides. So that's chapter 5 in the book. A lot of people in Maimonides' own time, or immediately after his death, especially during the 13th century, he died in 1204, a lot of people said, well, we don't like Maimonides because what Maimonides is telling us is highly elitist, so not all Jews can experience happiness equally or experience happiness at all. He offers a highly intellectualist understanding of what happiness is about, identifying happiness with intellectual perfection. He does tell Jews that they need to read non-Jews, especially the philosophical writing by non-Jews, primarily Aristotle, but also all his Muslim interpreters, in order to know what happiness is. And that created a controversy, an ongoing controversy. And during the 13th century, we have those three areas here Those are the three main themes of the phases of the Maimonidean controversy. But I would argue that to our own day, the Maimonidean controversy continues unabated. It always changes depending on the century, but the big debate right now in Israel, for example, about limudei liba, about core teaching, what should go into the curriculum of Haredi school, that's in a sense a repeat of the issues of the Maimonidean controversy. So it's very much with us. In the 13th century, we also see an alternative to Maimonides. When Kabbalists are saying, no, Maimonides is wrong, it's not about intellectual perfection. This is, of course, the basic diagram of the spherotic tree, of the spherotic structure. I won't teach you anything about Kabbalah, but basically in Kabbalah, or the Kabbalists in the 13th century, represented by the wonderful text of Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Brightness or Book of Brilliance. There are many translations of that term, or the Book of Enlightenment. When Sefer HaZohar is telling us that no, it's not about intellectual perfection, but it's a perfection, if you call it mystical perfection, but it's a mystical perfection that you can get to through performance of the mitzvot, but the performance of the commandments requires one to know the esoteric level. Here I will take issue with maybe Rabbi Dorf a little bit. There is an esoteric tradition in Judaism. There's a lot of esotericism in Judaism. In some ways, Maimonides himself could be read, as Strauss did, as an esotericist thinker, but definitely Kabbalah is not for everyone. Definitely Kabbalah is an esoteric interpretation of what Judaism really means and what the commandments mean and how to interact with God through the performance of the commandment. But already in the 13th century, we had an alternative conception of happiness contra Maimonides. So now you can say, okay, how do we resolve those debates? And here we go back to the Bible, because the Bible is where we need to start with every conversation about Judaism. I bring back Ellen Cherry. This is the woman I mentioned before. And what she does, which is so interesting, it's a very interesting book. I highly recommend that you take a look at it. But I really am very uncomfortable with the concept of asherism. Asherism, to turn something into ism, is really different from the way things are presented in the Bible. So we have a very problematic issue to deal with, and that's the issue of the linguistic richness and ambiguity that is part of the biblical narrative. These are some of the terms. Most of them are nouns, some of them are nouns, some of them are adjectives. But just to give you the sense of how complicated it is to talk about flourishing or happiness or pleasure or delight, and each one these are not, if you know the biblical text, you really know the greatness and the richness of it. So we are not, I don't think we can ever get out of the ambiguity of talking about flourishing or happiness. It's kind of built into the problem. But let's say we go Ashrei, as already Shira already mentioned that. That's where we need to start. In other words, when people say, "Well, whoever ever heard about Jews who are happy?" I would say, Jews go to the synagogue and say a particular mizmor from Tehillim, and of course they are all about happiness. I think that's what Judaism is all about: is how to be happy. But the question is, how do we understand the meaning of the term Asher or Ashrei or Ashur? And it's not simple. If in the Bible, 40 times we have the term, 26 of them in the Oops, there's a typo here. That's because I was doing it only last night and trying to introduce one more factor. But it's interesting that even biblical scholars don't even know how the word came about. So if you are a Akkadian scholar, you emphasize those roots about being upright or being in order. If you are in Egypt, or if you are more into Egyptian relationship to Hebrew, then you focus on slightly different meaning. The most useful way of thinking about it is what born biblical scholar already said, that when you say Ashrei, you actually recognize the objective condition of what that you can actually see. You observe it and you recognize it and you say, oh, how wonderful it is, how what a great, happy thing this is. Oh, how fortunate is this person who has experienced whatever you described. And we have other concepts related to in the biblical narrative, in the biblical text, whether it's derech or baruch, bracha. So what I'm trying to tell you that it's very difficult to turn it into ism, into asherism. But that's something that maybe if Ellen Cherry were here, we would have been able to explore it with her. I highly recommend this book to you. This is by most of the people in the book are actually non-Jewish scholars. I don't believe that even one is Jewish, but it's a very good book if you want to look at biblical theology of happiness. And the reason it's good, it's so useful, this book, is by giving us the differences between the various layers, if you wish, in the biblical text. So even if you just look at the Hebrew Bible, you have to differentiate between Torah and prophets and writings. Each one has a slightly different focus. But nonetheless, I think that, and here I fully agree with the approach of Shira, that the focus always kind of theology is part of the story. You tell it in the biblical narrative, the biblical worldview. There's enough there, despite all the layers and the subtleties and nuances that allow us to generalize about the Bible. And covenant, the concept of covenant, and the concept of reward, that's very much part of what flourishing is about. Flourishing, however, is experienced in the very goodness of earthly life. There is no mention of the afterlife. There's no mention of the soul. These are all later concepts that came to Judaism in the rabbinic period through interaction with the Greco-Roman world. She already mentioned Ashrei Ha'ish, Ashrei Ha'ish asher lo halach b'atzat rashaim. And here, what's good here is yesterday we had a debate kind of what does the word hatzlacha, what does success mean? But obviously that's the origin of that concept, that hatzlacha has to do with prosperity, with thriving. So you have kind of the organic layer of the meaning, or the organic roots of that concept is always there. That's why I love this imagery of this tree that comes out of the text. It's a beautiful way of illustrating what the idea. But you can see that you have an entire theology here. And the biblical text tells you the connection between studying the Torah of the Lord and thriving. So that's the basic religious understanding, I think, in the Judaic tradition of what happiness is all about. You cannot thrive without being out of the path charted for you or paid for you by the Torah, by the revealed will of God. So in that sense, happiness in Judaism is a religious concept from the very beginning. However, in the modern period, it has been secularized, as we should just see. So the contribution of rabbinic Judaism on it, and I highly recommend, if you want historical understanding of the evolution of the Jewish tradition, I highly recommend this relatively new book, co-edited by several people, by 3 people, and the Jewish virtue ethics is how I would like to position the conversation about happiness within Judaism. So again, there's no way to think about the rabbinic Judaism without thinking about happiness, but also without thinking how it's linked to Torah study, to prayer, and to good deeds. So kind of, if you ask me, the bottom line here, maybe is a addition to what we heard yesterday from Rabbi Eisen. In a sense, I think that Jews remain Jewish because they thought that they really had the path to happiness. They really had it. They had the revealed Torah. The revealed Torah paves a certain way that you have to walk in. Kind of that's the Tao of the Jewish tradition. And if you do it, you get to the reward in Olam Haba, in the world to come. So immortality is very much part of why you're doing all this. You're doing it on some level in order to have life after death. That death is not the end of the story. It's just a portal to something that will happen after death. So all this, so in Kabbalah and in philosophy, we have, I do suggest to all of us that we cannot just think about being active in the earthly world without thinking about, at least in the pre-modern world, what it means for the individual human soul, and how what you do in the earthly world will bring about, I guess in some even you can say it in some karmic way, if you want to think about Sachar Va'onesh, like karma. If you do the right thing, then you will be rewarded. But it's not only if you do the right thing, it's also if you think the right way and if you develop your intellect in the right way. So that's the pre-modern view of philosophers that I would say very much is with us still. Now, a big development. These are the three areas in which, three regions in which we're going to see a lot of discussion in the early modern period, 16th century, roughly from 1600, let's say, to 1800, a lot of discussion about happiness. I can briefly go through these elements, but again, I'm not entirely sure that I would buy the idea the Jews had a particular vision before everybody else. I like to emphasize the interplay between Jewish thought and non-Jewish thought, non-Jewish culture, and we definitely see it in Renaissance humanism. So here are some suggestions for us. In Renaissance humanism, what we see is a kind of a return back to the classical world, focus on Stoic texts, especially some Epicurean texts, but also some people listen also to Neoplatonic texts. But the bottom line is that there's the art of living well. And if you learn how to live well, you have to learn from the ancient how to enjoy, it's not so much about joy, but how to function well in a civic society. And the civic society that the humanists are focusing about, it's not just the people in religious orders or not just people who listen to what Christian authorities are telling them, it's the lay Christian person. So there's a real shift. Maybe Professor Eisen would say, well, they learned it from the Jews. I'm not sure I'm buying it entirely, that approach, but what is clear is that they go to text from the ancient period and they're trying to adapt it to a new reality, the Renaissance reality. So there's no doubt that with Renaissance humanism, the focus is on the dignity of the human. I can do a whole course or a whole lecture just on that, but clearly we cannot think about what happens in the Renaissance without realizing they spent a lot of time thinking and reflecting about happiness. And what's interesting to me is that the humanists started to be a lot more honest about emotions, about human emotions, not just your ideas. It's not just what you know, it's what you feel. And also your desires, your lust, your pride, the negative aspect of being a human. And they create a whole new way of thinking about being human. That's what we call humanism, right? As Renaissance humanism, to which the Jews contributed and also were deeply influenced by. So I would like to suggest one way of thinking about it, that in the 16th, 17th centuries, when Jewish philosophy in general, the Aristotelian tradition kind of lost some of its creativity, shall we say, lost some of its power. It's still in existence, but it's not as powerful. Whereas Kabbalah, especially Lurianic Kabbalah, is very important. And what you see in Lurianic Kabbalah, the Kabbalah that came out of Tzfat, out of this little town in the land of Israel in the 16th century. Lurianic, to those who are not familiar with it, Lurianic is named after Isaac Luria. But you have here is a lot of interest, which the new studies of Eitan Fishbein are really bringing to the fore, how you have a lot of exploration of one's inner life, of the inner psyche, of the individual mystic. So we have their diaries, we have their mystical reports, we have their confessions. We know an awful lot about them in a way that we did not know the same way in the earlier period. Even on Zohar, we don't know as much as we know about these guys from the 16th century. So one way of thinking about it is to look at Lurianic Kabbalah as a way of Jewish self-fashioning, which is not so different from what the humanists were doing. But my point is, all of this is done in a highly religious language, a religious idiom. There's no secularism here. It's not civic humanism. It's something very Jewish, very religious, and but also very personal and very psychologically oriented. So if you're not familiar with this book of Jonathan Garb, it's a great book, The Yearnings of the Soul. So happiness, in one way of thinking about happiness and flourishing, is about the yearnings of the soul. I love that title, and it's a great book. Now, all this is challenged big time by Spinoza. So we all know Spinoza, and basically Spinoza is arguing against the notion that there is connection, a causal connection between the philosophical language that you acquire in life and kind of not just philosophy, but that philosophy and being a good Jew will get you to immortality, the immortality of the intellect. No, so he's definitely changing it. He's changing the language, the way to think about it, the way to think about God, the way to think about Torah, the way to think about Jewish law. Everything is challenged by Spinoza, and maybe historically speaking, we can understand why the Jewish community of Amsterdam excommunicated him, because the challenge was too much for the community for various historical reasons to sustain. They just couldn't sustain. But in some ways, Spinozism is also very much part of where we are today in the modern world. And I suggest to you that maybe Daniel Kahneman, who I'll show you later on a slide, maybe Daniel Kahneman, who is very known to people who write on subjective well-being, is a kind of a contemporary Spinoza, or some kinds of a person that can be situated in that tradition. We continue with the changes in the Jewish tradition. And again, I'm skipping an awful lot of historical knowledge, but my point here that you cannot, after Spinoza, with the beginning of modernity in the 18th century, and when does modernity start for Jews? That's a big issue. But my point is that we could not have had, I'll put it this way: we could not have. I'm trying to really get to the heart of the matter. Jews in the 18th century begin to change the way they look at the society around them. In the 18th century, they begin to want to be part of the society around them and to change their tradition from within. And the key figure in that really transformative process is Moses Mendelssohn. And with Mendelssohn, again, you have a person who is a totally traditional Jew, continues to live as a traditional Jew, but becomes the expression of the top of the German intellectual world, endorsing all of those ideas here: human dignity, freedom, tolerance, reason. These are the ideas of the Enlightenment. And then he's arguing that Judaism is the tradition that expresses those ideas. Now, obviously, if it's the same thing, if Judaism is, and you have to observe halakha, what's the point? Why remaining a traditional Jew? And he came up in the book Jerusalem, he came up with this distinction between revealed legislation, but not revealed truth. So for him, Judaism is not about a revelation of, shall we say, dogmas, if you wish, because what you need to know, you already know by reason. But it is about legislation, particular practices that only Jews are obligated to do. And for him, there is an overlap, not identical, but an overlap between being happy as a Jew and being happy as a human being who is a rational person. That I think we are now getting into the heart of the matter. What does it mean to be happy in the modern period? What does it mean to be Jewish? Do I need to observe the law? What's the point? What am I getting by remaining Jewish? All of those conundrums, which were not the conundrum of the medieval period, are not going to be with us. So the Haskalah is a very much, Mendelssohn is considered, as you know, kind of the father of the Haskalah, although it's a complicated issue. But the bottom line is, in the Haskalah, we have a new vision of what happiness should be all about. It's all a continuation of the virtue ethics tradition. It's all about how you need to behave in a certain way as a Jew, but at the same time, you have to be philosophically inclined. You have to really acquire and cultivate. Those are the virtues that the maskil, that the person who really is an educated Jew should acquire. So here you go. The maskilim, this particular one, Menachem Levin, they knew what other people were writing at the same time. So he read Benjamin Franklin, he read John Locke, he read Rousseau, and put together a Judaic version of what the ideal person and the flourishing person is going to be. But we clearly have a change with the Haskalah. And again, all of us in Jewish studies wouldn't be here without the Haskalah movement. So all of the processes that I'm trying to kind of bring into this conversation are very much with us today. Even this conference is part of the tradition started with the Haskalah tradition. Of course, the Maskilim created oppositions to them, but also some opposition, like the ultra-Orthodox opposition, was much more critical. The ultra-Orthodox position represented by Moshe Sofer, Khatam Sofer, is not interested in integration, is not interested in the Enlightenment, but the dominant position is this position, what we call neo-Orthodox position, represented by Samson Raphael Hirsch. And here you will see a Jewish thinker who says, well, you know what? The Torah is actually not just for Jews. That's Mendelssohn's position. So no, the Torah is a good thing for humanity. So you have this quote when it's an amazing quote, I think. The Torah is the unique message of God addressed to men in its totality. So in other words, if you want to be happy, be Jewish. That's kind of the message, as I understand, the big project of what Samson Raphael Hirsch was trying to convey. And modern Orthodoxy today, including Rabbi Soloveitchik, including Rabbi Sachs, including Rabbi Norman Lamb, these are all heirs to the position of Samson Raphael Hirsch. A very different approach is represented, different from Samson Raphael Hirsch, is by Hasidism. So Hasidism, we find indeed the emphasis on the centrality of joy, focus on affect, use of music, dancing, even hard liquor to transform consciousness or to transform feelings. And the idea here that you can worship God, okay, avodah bagashmiyut means you worship God through the corporeal world. So you don't have to wait and just think about the afterlife as something abstract and philosophical and cerebral and intellectual. No, being alive in the world means all of those things, especially the emotional aspect. But there's a lot of emphasis on interiority, which continues what Kabbalah was doing in the 16th century. So even if you know the story of Rabbi Sachs that Shira spoke about, you know that Rabbi Sachs himself saw himself as a student in a sense of two figures. Soloveitchik, that's the cerebral, that's the intellectual, right? Halachic, the legal, the juristic, and Rabbi Milubavitch. So in a sense, what we find with Rabbi Sachs is an attempt to combine both of those traditions in a very unique way. But clearly the conception of happiness and flourishing here is different than what it was in the more kind of cerebral intellectual tradition of neo-Orthodoxy. The problems, and that's kind of to get closer to where we are today, everything changes from the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century. So happiness is going to change. That the Enlightenment tradition will be very much with us, and these two kind of ideologies, in a sense, represent the Enlightenment tradition and its approach to happiness. But there's going to be also an alternative tradition. These two are wonderful, wonderful books. And if I really would like to put a plug for the Jewish materialism book, because he really shows how the changes in Jewish self-understanding from the 1870s on, when labor and people and land, that's, if you want to figure out how to flourish, well, think about labor. Think about making sure that people will not suffer from poverty. Think about dealing with very concrete issues such as ownership of a land, because without the land, you cannot really have what it takes to be, what it takes to flourish as a people. So all of those four ideologies, I think, derive from this shift in Jewish intellectual thought in the 1870s. And again, we don't have the time to go on it, but I'm just suggesting something for you to think about. Think how this kind of map of Jewish, this spectrum of Jewish positions, how each one of them can be seen as a different way of being happy, a different approach to the question, okay, how do I flourish? How do I thrive? What does it take? And each one will give you a different analysis of what's the problem. And why are we languishing, to use the language of Corey Keyes? Why are we languishing in one scenario? How can we flourish in another scenario? So that's my point, that happiness is very much part of the internal Jewish debate even today. Now, all this is going to be challenged big time, of course, by the rise of the sciences of the psyche, if you wish, and the critique of religion by Freud. But Freud should be understood as an example of the secularization of Western culture, represented, of course, by science. And when Freud is telling us that to be happy, it's all about pleasure. It's the pleasure principle. It's in a sense, he argues for hedonic psychology and for, I say, on some level, even hedonism. So having read quite a lot of Freud in the last year or two, I have to say that he really was a very unhappy person in a sense, and a person who actually did not believe that happiness is feasible in the world. What you actually have is a basic condition of unhappiness. Maybe Professor Habron will agree with that, and he has a whole book on unhappiness. But we have some basic. The human condition is not one of thriving, and the question is, what can we do to thrive a little bit more? Get rid of religion. That's the whole point of this book, 1927 book. Religion is the problem, and we need to do something to move beyond religion. Well, the story is more complex because Freud is just the beginning of the story of psychoanalysis, not the end of the story. And there were other thinkers, which I do not cover in this lecture, but in my writings I do, such as Alfred Adler, who was mentioned also in Professor Keyes' lecture, and from examples of other people who understood the psychoanalytic approach differently than Freud, while recognizing Freud and, of course, being very much part of the same tradition. So I want to bring to your attention the fact that the involvement of Jews in what I call the therapeutic culture or the psychoanalytic culture, you can call it any way you want, that this Jews were very much part of the secularization of tradition and with it the secularization of the discourse on happiness. All of these books are absolutely fascinating. This book was written in 1946, was a big bestseller, written by a Reform rabbi who actually tried to show how you can integrate psychoanalysis and religion. But these two books are by historians. So this book, especially by Andrew Heinze, is a very good book about the involvement of Jews as psychoanalysts, as administrators of mental institutes, as of course, as therapists, as social workers. So we are living in a culture that is rife with Jewish involvement in psychoanalysis, psychology, psychotherapy. And you could, of course, make jokes about it, but that's our reality, how much it has become part of popular culture. And it's all relevant to what's going to happen to the concept of happiness. So again, if I had more time, or here are some of the people who influence what we call humanistic psychology. So you can say, well, that could be seen as part of secularization, but just to be sure what I mean by secularization doesn't mean that you're anti-religion or anti-Judaism, or they are totally negating your Jewish roots. No, that's Freud's way of experiencing secularization, but not the way that these people experience the process of secularization. So you can be very much, as we heard in this conference, working with Jewish ethos, or working or interpreting or developing ideas that come from the way you grew up as a Jew, and taking it in a different way. But none of these people are observant Jews, and that even includes Buber. They're not observant Jews, but yet they're very Jewish and very much culturally rooted. Now, the story of the conversation about happiness in our own time has changed greatly. Everybody from psychology is familiar with Martin Seligman. Some people those who studied like Adam Cohen in the University of Pennsylvania probably know him personally. But Martin Seligman really shaped the whole conversation, the whole way we think about happiness today. And the bottom line is that happiness is something that can be learned. I actually think there's a lot of Aristotelianism, a lot of indebtedness to Aristotle. He himself, for his BA, he was a student of philosophy. Then he went to psychology. And then in 1998, he became the president of the American Psychological Association. He really said to his colleagues, look, guys, we need to move away from the Freudian tradition, away from the behavioral tradition, and we need to develop positive psychology as a way to allow people to thrive rather than focusing on their pathologies and what's problematic about their life. And he puts I see a lot of a lot of remnant in Aristotelianism in his view. But this is we are talking about a person who became everybody in social psychology would know what I'm saying here, became a big name worldwide. So we think about global happiness today very much along the lines that were articulated first by Martin Seligman. Those are two very famous books of his. This is the first book from 2004. This is a book from 2011, and I highly recommend that you read the book if you care to know about where the conversation about flourishing, how did it start in about 20 years ago, this particular direction, and where it's going today. So here are two, again, people here from social psychology are familiar. Sonia Lyubomirsky, I invited her to participate, but she was too involved in promoting her new book, so she said no. She has a new book about joy, actually. But the her point is that you can teach people how to be happy. You just have to give them the exercises. You have to explain what it is. It's a very doable thing. And what you need to do, of course, is to get rid of the myth, get rid of what doesn't really get you happy and what does. Another person who was mentioned already by Pninit is Tal Ben-Shahar. Again, she even mentioned his concept of whole being, but whole being, or the acronym of SPIRE, is spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, emotional well-being. So it's kind of a holistic approach. That is most, I think that book is the most recent one. I think it's from 2021. And if you want to know what happiness studies is and how it's all done as a secularist enterprise, scientific, semi-academic, or kind of uses academic studies, but really written for the general public, his books are going to be very useful. And he indeed wrote the introduction to Rabbi Sachs' books, which Shira mentioned, and we will see in a slide or two later. So that's, of course, Daniel Kahneman. It's interesting to compare. This is a highly academic book, and if you compare this analysis of well-being to the work of Lyubomirsky or Tal Ben-Shahar, you can see the difference. And they're using the same kind of knowledge, but they're pitching it very, very differently to the general reader. This is actually not a book for a general reader. This is really for academic specialists. And I suggest to look at him kind of as a continuation of the Spinozistic tradition of Spinoza, because even his decision, in case you don't know, he decided to commit to die with dignity in Switzerland, but with medical help. Even that was a very interesting decision that I think probably Spinoza would have approved. But anyway, in case you don't know, Kahneman is a product of the Hebrew University. I remember him in the Hebrew University from 50 years ago, of course. We're at the same time, but he and Amos Tversky really shaped a lot of the conversation in the field of psychology and science of well-being. So we already mentioned the World Happiness Movement. This is just to tell you, this is just to show you the shift in the conversation. In the pre-modern world, we talked about the immortality of the soul. Now we are talking, when we talk about happiness or flourishing, we talk about something which is measured, quantified, compared, analyzed, and you come up with various policies to deal with. This is Richard Layard, who is a good friend of Martin Seligman, and this, of course, as you can see, Israel here. Pninit mentioned this particular study. But clearly, you saw in the lecture from Pnimit how there's more to it than just a number on the scale. But once you get into kind of under the surface, you see the complexity of it. But again, today happiness is happiness for everybody across the world in comparative way, and you have to do it through quantification. Quantification is the path to happiness, not knowledge of necessary truth. And that has led to a phenomenon of kind of the what some people call here, this is a very critical book, the happiness industry, that you write books published in millions of copies for people who really want to be happy. This is a very interesting book, a critical book by a French intellectual, Catholic, from Catholic background, when he's arguing that you kind of telling us we have to be happy. Well, if we are not happy, we are feeling awful about it because we feel guilty that we have failed to be happy. And this, you probably know, Eva Iluz is an Israeli sociologist, quite controversial to some people, but she also coming from the same, this is the kind of the French left, if you wish. And she's very critical of how the expectation to be happy is now translated into what happens in companies, and how you produce, you put in place happiness officers, or making sure, even at ASU, we have a wellness program that makes sure that people have wellness. Well, all this is highly criticized by people on the left that are basically saying this is undermining human freedom. So now we can come to all right, where are the Jewish thinkers? Where are they? And what do they tell us? We've seen what sociologists and psychologists, what they say about happiness, and how the knowledge, all the quantification, all the quantifiable and quantified data enables them to come up with a deeper understanding for the phenomenon. But what do theologians say about it? So I'll just give you four. So Mordechai Kaplan is a very interesting, of course, everything that Mordechai Kaplan did has something to do with happiness, because here this supports the point that Professor Eisen made yesterday. The focus is on this world, and God has to be understood as a fire that makes for salvation in the mundane world through social action, through activities that are structured by what he called the sancta, they kind of the particular language, if you wish, of the Jewish tradition. That's all true. But it's all about this world, celebrating life in this world. It's not about life it's not about the afterlife. It's about self-actualization, very much along the lines articulated by Abraham Maslow, who already was mentioned. So Kaplan is one way of thinking about what it means to be Jewish, and how to be Jewish, and how to flourish in this world. If you go to Soloveitchik, you see a different approach to what it means to be. Alan earlier mentioned his typology of Adam 1 and Adam 2, the two paradigms of the creation narrative in the Bible. But in a sense, the point the real issue is that to understand the dialectical nature of human beings. So the tension between Adam 1 and Adam 2 is always something that we experience in ourselves. And for him, only halacha, only the halachic structure, or the structure of the world of halacha can have those two, Adam 1 and Adam 2, together without one dominating the other. And so because he's such a dialectical thinker and understands the paradoxicality of being a human, that he thinks that only halakha deals or can deal successfully with the paradoxality of being a human. So that's a second approach. A third approach is illustrated by Zalman Schachter Shalomi, the founder of the Jewish Renewal Movement. Here, what you get is a lot closer to where I started the lecture, with a focus on the organic dimension, the organicity that is underlying the concept of flourishing. So he is an ecological thinker, comes from a Hasidic background, became really the founder of you can call it, as people do, neo-Hasidic way of being Jewish. And this neo-Hasidism has great openness toward the culture at large, you can take from the culture, from other spiritual traditions, whether it's yoga, meditation, chanting, whatever it is, but you can create a whole new way of being Jewish in the modern world. You can actually call it the postmodern world that will be ecologically minded. So the concept of the thriving tree is very much in accordance with his vision. And toward the end of this presentation, of course, you cannot think about happiness today, but the challenges, and for him, as Shira already showed correctly, there is a tension between, or he highlights the tension between happiness and joy. For him, Judaism is not about happiness, but rather about joy. And as Shira knows, my essay in this volume is actually to show that he wasn't really telling the full story, because the Maimonidean tradition is part of Judaism. It's no less part of Judaism than anything else. So I think that he kind of didn't tell the full story of Aristotelianism within Judaism, and why he made this decision. I have some speculation, but the bottom line is that he shows us a way to be Jewish in a way that focuses on the we rather than on the I, focuses on that, focuses on the practices of being Jewish, very much along the lines that we just heard from Rabbi Dorf. And his message is, again, not so different from the message of Samson Raphael Hirsch, when he's saying, we've got the solution to the human condition. The human condition today is loneliness, anxiety, hedonism, consumerism. All this is bad. Our society is falling apart. And Jonathan Sachs, R.I. Sachs, is saying, no, I've got an answer to that situation, and that's called Judaism. And if you're not familiar with some popular books, this is kind of, I want to end with that, kind of where is Jewish in the post-secular age. I've written quite a lot about what is post-secularism and so forth, but the idea here is you have books that are, in a sense, selling, if you wish, selling Judaism to the general public, telling them how wonderful everything is. And maybe some people buy it, but I would have to say against this kind of, or critical of this approach, that what are we doing with secular Jews, which are, numerically speaking, no less are a very important element in contemporary Judaism, but it means to be a secular Jew. So it's not that post-secular means no more secular. No, we are all secularized, and we are all secular to some extent. And the question is, okay, so how are we going to be Jewish in this new environment? So clearly this is a response, but not necessarily the only response. So the conference that we just did here is, in a sense, a response to all this, by saying, if we want to think clearly, deeply, responsibly, and in a sophisticated way about happiness and about flourishing and about well-being, we need to know all the stuff that is available out there. We need to know, we need to be immersed in this scientific literature, and in the not just scientific in the narrow sense, but in the broad sense of, let's call it, in the academic literature. And that's what I've been trying to do in the conferences. So I'm not going to teach people how to be happy, but I hope that all of us are going to be quite satisfied and living a good life in this new year of 2026 by learning. And for me, as a Jewish intellectual historian, the real key issue to flourishing is always to learn about the past, to reflect about the present, and to ponder the meaning of the future. So thank you very much. And now we can have questions.
Thank you, Hava, for a tour de force of running through Jewish thought on these topics. And I guess we can have questions, or people can put them in the chat. I didn't see any questions or observations, or.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of material. So, but this is really the concept, the discourse. I'll put it this way: if you think of it in terms of discourse, discourse means that it's a conversation that goes on and on through debate, through kind of questions and answer, if you wish, and opposition and criticism and so forth. We are going to be in this discourse for as long as there are Jews, I would say, and perhaps as long as there are human beings. But that's why I kind of think that the historical approach, intellectual history, allows us to bring it all together. And that's what I try to do in this presentation.
Maybe I can ask your thoughts on. I mean, I'm thinking about the dominant forces
go ahead.
in our lives today, and whether I guess two come to mind quickly. One is social media, and the other, of course, is the topic of the day, AI. And I don't know if you've thought about how those relate to encouraging, producing, discouraging, making worse issues of flourishing, well-being, etc.
Very much, as I'm sure, I believe you know that I've been writing for now 20 years about transhumanism and writing critically about transhumanism. So my critique of technology, and AI is just the most kind of the most developed, the most sophisticated form of the same problem. But yeah, I view it very critically because I think it diminishes the ability of humans to flourish. AI may even totally undermine the ability of humans to flourish. That's why I'm much more committed to the kind of organismic or environmental understanding of what flourishing is. You cannot flourish if you are not connected, really, through your roots. You have to be rooted in the natural world. We are animals, after all, and we are connected to the natural environment in a way that is dictated to us by who we are. So we are not just a mind that can sustain itself in some kind of a spiritual blessedness after the death of the body. Maybe that can happen, I'm not sure, but clearly not according to Spinoza. But what we do know that we have to live in a way that allows us to breathe the air and to drink the water and to eat what comes out of the soil. And right now, our technological development is such that we are undermining our ability to really thrive and flourish on this world. So for me, the connection between all of those areas in my writings is very close. Happiness, environmentalism, critique of technology, all related to each other.
But I guess what I think about the sinister part about AI is, and now people are pushing back, is its connection to nature, especially in the use of electricity and water, and yet that's obfuscated. No one wants to talk about that, but what if we really push that? And people are beginning to recognize that's a real problem here in Arizona. I saw there's just today, we're a shortage of water, and we have big AI data centers. So it's a really interesting issue, and how would we critique
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah. No. It's known, it's recognized that data centers are environmental disaster. But because we are so keen on, right now we are in the midst of a major gold rush. The gold rush is after the money that will come from the AI technology. So what would that do to to the foundation of our life remains to be seen, but I'm not at all optimistic about it. We at least we need to talk about it. But what does that mean? That you're going to stop funding a data center? Most likely you won't, because who is going to do that? Who is going to stop the data center? Who is going to say something to Elon Musk? No, you cannot do this and that, or to Jeff Bezos. So we lost the capacity, our critical capacity, either to regulate. I'm very much for regulation, but we did not enter the regulative or the regulatory process early enough, or creatively enough. So right now it's really unregulated, and the disasters to come are not sure to come. There's going to be a real problem in the next 2 decades or 3 decades, unless I'm wrong, and technology will really get us out of this conundrum. That's what some of those techno-optimists offer us. But I still owe you an answer on social media. I've written also very critically about that form of communication and what it has done for youngsters, especially. So I'm a major, I think it's horrible what's happening right now in social media. And if you ask why people are so lonely, why there's so much violence, why there's so much bullies, bullying behavior, it's all because of what is allowed on social media. So now people are talking more. For example, they decided in certain schools you won't be able to get your smartphone to school. I think that we need to put more limits on what can be done with the text. But that, some people are going to say, well, it's undermining my freedom. I need to have my freedom to do whatever I want. Well, so how are we going to handle that? That remains to be seen. So, these are all connected problems. But I won't choose to begin to think happiness is very much part of the message of Judaism. We would not be here in the 21st century talking about happiness if Jews didn't pray about it, think about it, talk about it, wrote about it. Happiness is very much a Jewish issue. That's kind of the bottom line of our message.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments, observations?
Okay. What would happiness mean in the context of the handicap principle, namely the evolutionary conjecture that animals and people in the present context often take burdens on themselves in order to promote their chances for survival and their well-being? This idea is applicable, for example, for Haredi people in warm lands who dress up in ways which seem very uncomfortable. How can the happiness principle account for such self-burden? And more generally, to be frank, for religious practices as such?
Interesting.
I don't know, Joel. That may be a question more to you than to me. Well, I need some time to think about it, Nadav.
Well, I guess
maybe Lisa, can you? Go ahead.
I was about to
suggest that Lisa can make Nadav into a speaker, into a panelist, and then we can talk about it.
When I saw the question, I was thinking about the contrast: is survival the same thing as happiness? So,
okay, so thank you. Obviously, no. Survival is the minimum. It's what the organism does in order to succeed. And if you think, especially in Jonas's terms, basically against the death principle. So how being opposes non-being. Thriving is much more than survival. And thriving, that's why I think that thriving helps us. We can get to the heart of the matter much better if we think in organic metaphors, because it is an organic concept. So I, as a person who loves to garden, even though here in Arizona I don't garden, but think of it, if you're a gardener, you know when your plants are thriving, and actually I'll use Corey Keith's language, when they're languishing. And I would love to figure out a good Hebrew translation to that word. I don't have it.
I looked it up. It says lahit mogeg.
Languishing?
That's what the translation said. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's the word it used.
No way. Lahit mogeg is the opposite of language. Language is כמו להיות נמק. Ulay Nadav, maybe you have an idea how we can think about languishing. But I think that when you thrive, as a gardener, when the garden thrives and when it doesn't. As human beings, and maybe Professor Keith will also agree, as human beings, we can see when the person, or any psychologist, any therapist knows when the human being thrives, when they function well, that it doesn't mean that they're not sad, or they don't have frustration, or they don't have some negative emotions, but on the whole they thrive. So I think that thriving thinking about thriving and flourishing and happiness in organic or organistic metaphors is the best way to get to the heart of it. But that's way beyond survival.
Yeah.
Okay, Nadav is on, but he needs to unmute him if possible.
Hi, Hava.
Hi, Nadav. Yeah, be glad to hear from you.
Thank you. I didn't, prepare, take, care of my hairstyle. So thank you for allowing me to show my face. But really, thank you. As Joel said, really tour de force of really amazing perspective on this concept of happiness. מהתנ"ך עד לפלמ"ח.
Yeah.
From the Tanakh to the Pelmach, and really inspiring insights. And since I had the chance to hear you more, and of course to read your work on this, everything is very well backed up, scholarly. So maybe just to paraphrase this question from another angle, really, what's the sense? It's easy to to ask about Haredi people in this regard, but the question, as we know from Freud, is really more basic about religious practices as such, and many of them are not just mere moral dictates, and so there is really a question of why people undertake of their free choice, the burden to fulfill many ritual laws, but maybe also many, supererogation precepts that are moral, but yet still, in many cases, just not comfortable.
So I guess the way to kind of frame your question would be, what's the point of being religious if you can thrive without it? Would that be the question that you're really after? I would say that again, I'm speaking as an historian. So for the pre-modern Jew, and for many beyond that, but definitely for the pre-modern Jews, the only way to thrive would be through the performance of undertaking all those burdens, the intellectual, the on some level, even some ascetic quality of those burdens. But you could not thrive outside the framework. The challenge, everything begins to be much more complicated once we have the option of secularism. And we all are we're all stuck in a sense in this problem for the last 200 or 250 years of being of a secular world in which, as Charles Steller showed us, belief in God is only one option, but you have the other beliefs. So that's the question. What does it mean for Jews, secular Jews, to thrive? I think that the lecture by Pninit from this morning actually shows how psychology and understanding the Israeli culture, which is secular, but not only secular, it's secularized culture, how you can be in Israel and deal with very complex issues of life and death, of loss, of trauma, and so forth, but come up with a way of thriving despite of it, and not necessarily in a religious idiom. I'm not sure that option is available to Jews in the diaspora. That's kind of the dilemma. So to secular Jews in the diaspora, they don't have what Israeli Jews have. And then the question is, okay, I'm Jewish, so what does that mean? Eating bagel, listening to certain whatever programs on radio or television, on film. What is my Jewishness? So the question of what is Jewishness in a secular environment, that's the challenge of our day. And I don't know if Shira is still on the talk, but I was intrigued by the fact that Tal Ben Shachar wrote the introduction to Rabbi Sachs' book. And I wondered, why was that the case? I thought that Tal Ben Shachar actually represents a secularist perspective, so I was surprised. If Shira is here, maybe she can comment on it, but I don't know if she is.
When I heard Nadav's question in part, I think about what's the role of suffering? Is there a positive value to suffering to achieve flourishing?
Okay.
Would you mind would you mind if I addressed the question from
Yeah, go ahead,
evolution?
please.
Yeah,
Please.
so I'm trying to turn on, there it is. Oops. All the settings. So from an evolutionary psychology, there's a theory called the credibility enhancing displays, and these are practices that people engage in to signal their membership in the group. And so people might do these things that are very almost, self-deprecating or harmful to themselves, hurting themselves even sometimes. It can really get out of hand, honestly. But fasting actually is one of those things that people do this to indicate that it's a form of suffering, but you're still doing it to indicate that you're part of the group. And does that help, Nadav, to answer a little bit of why people might do some of these or engage in
I mean,
some?
it's interesting you mentioned fasting because the biblical word is inui nefesh, which is often translated as suffering or self-inflicted limitation in some sense. So,
Self-inflicted, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but when you do
Yeah.
this, you are very much indicating that you're part of this group. And all religious groups have these things that these practices, these little indicators that you're part of the group. So I don't know if he's still there, if that helps or not.
Well, I think that along the lines of
I mean, it makes me think of in terms of Christianity, if you have a strong notion of imitatio Christi as a central value, which has its moment in Christianity, look at modern, whether you call gospel of success, what happened to that whole side of Christian tradition?
Yeah. So whatever his name, Joel forgot his last name. This minister
Osteen.
Osteen,
Joel
yeah,
Osteen.
Joel Osteen. So you're right. So I would say that the study by by Catherine and Adam Cohen actually shows how some discomfort is not antithetical to thriving. If it leads you to deepening your understanding, deepening your commitment, deepening your, you care of others, that's an example how at least limited suffering. Now, with ascetic tradition, it's a different story because you take those inui nefesh, those forms of torment in a longer period of time, and it can become but definitely have it in Kabbalah. Definitely, Kabbalah has that element quite strong, at least in the 16th century. Not in Hasidism, of course, but so I think that yes, some suffering is not antithetical to flourishing, but prolonged suffering it's an issue. Actually, Catherine, you remember the conference we had on human flourishing when we had a story, when we have a case of a woman who said, look, I survived cancer, breast cancer, all conversation, how being suffering from illness does not necessarily mean that you're not thriving. You can thrive, but obviously the world becomes very elastic in this sense. Clearly, you have moments when you go through treatment that you cannot say you are thriving, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be losing sense of meaning in life or losing a sense of desire to live, or not necessarily. So, but the
maybe
question is,
we should end.
Let's say, so I'm wishing you all a year of flourishing, a happy year in which we will all continue to kind of bring together various approaches that come from the academy, from the various ways of being Jewish, from other traditions, all to try to figure out how to thrive and how to be happy. So thank you all. It's been a very rewarding experience.
Thank you so much, Hava, for organizing it, and everybody have a good year.
Oh, you have, I miss it, Joel. You miss it from Paul Wolpe about Buddhism.
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Yeah, I missed the point that Buddhism, did you see that? Yeah. All righty. Thanks a lot to all. And thank you, Joel, for chaperoning this last session.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Everybody, I would say, enjoy the Olympics when you think about all those people, what they put in hours of training for the 2 minutes on the course. So that's part of this.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. That people who are engaged in professional sports. Sure. Thanks a lot.